All right, here's part 2 of lecture 4. We're still looking at that classical tradition during the Baroque period, so Baroque classicism. And now our subject is an artist named Nicolas Poussin. Remember, when we were looking briefly at the Northern Renaissance, I said that the German artist Dürer left his native Germany and traveled south to Italy in order to enrich his art through studying the sources of the Italian Renaissance. And I said to remember that because Dürer has set an important precedent. Well, that's exactly what Poussin did, knowing that he is much out of step with the Italian Renaissance and classical tradition, whose birthplace was there in Italy. He decided to leave his native France and travel to Italy. And there, in Rome, he stayed most of his career. He occasionally went back to his native France, but predominantly worked in Rome and sent his canvases back to French clients. Here is a wonderful example of Poussin's brand of Baroque classicism. The title is Judgment of Solomon, done about mid-century, 1649. And you might ask, so, what's classical about this painting? And hopefully, by now, you can pick out some of the main characteristics. One is narrative clarity. The story is taken from the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament. And even if you're not that familiar with the plot line, the body language and positioning of the characters really walk you through the script. In the center is Solomon, the judge, and before him, two women have approached, and they have brought in two infants. One is dead on the right, and another one is very much alive, kicking and screaming on the left there. And both women, of course, claim the living baby to be theirs. They claim to be the biological mother. And neither budge on their assertion. So Solomon, famously, in his Solomaic wisdom, says, let the child be cut in half and a half given to each of the mothers. The reaction of the bystanders on the right, especially the women and maybe that little kid there, is like horror. You can hear the shrieks and how they recoil from the harshness of this decision. But the one on the left, a mother on the left in yellow, waves her hand as if calling off the bet. She recants. She backs down from her story saying, no, I lied. I'm not the mother. Let the child live. And of course, she is the mother. But she is not willing to have her child sacrificed. And Solomon's body language up to that point imitated the very scales of justice. Nothing showed partiality to the left or the right. He was absolutely bilateral, except when the mother on our left says, no, I recant my story, Solomon's eyes shift to her, and he knows that she is the true mother. So he pronounces his judgment and gives the child to the rightful woman. In addition to narrative clarity, we have geometric clarity. The composition is divided in half, and the left half is a mirror image of the right half. You have a group of bystanders on the right, reflected on the left by this group. You also have the architecture that reiterates this symmetry and centrality. And straight out of that classical tradition, we have the triangle, dead center, centralizing and stabilizing the composition. All of this we saw in Raphael's work, who codified the grand manner, in the regularity of the architectural backdrop and the carefully choreographed crowd scene in the foreground, the centralized geometry of the classical mode of expression. Another feature we see that it's closed composition. Everything turns inward. The spectators and the women all look towards the center. There's nothing that really guides our eye outside of the Albertian window. It's focused dead on. Planarity. Look at that. Look at the architectural backdrop. It's shallow. It doesn't go very far back at all, but it absolutely parallels the picture plane. And look at the pavement. Again and again, it reinforces the parallel path of the picture plane. Local color, another feature of the classical mode of expression. Look, that's red, that's a green, and that's yellow. Not putting much thought into variations. The linearity and the sculptural modeling of the classical tradition we also see in the individual figures. And uniform clarity. Look, I'm going to highlight 3 areas: background, midground, and then the foreground. Come up closer, and they are all given equal attention, equal description. That's the uniform clarity. Nothing is suppressed visually from the viewer. Art as politics. Let's look at the political content of this painting. The classical mode of expression was the intellectual mode, and frequently it was used to convey didactic messages as clearly as possible so that the people, the masses, would understand the content. In charge of France was this guy, Louis XIV, King of France, known also as the Sun King, and he ruled his country with an iron fist. He wanted everything to be under control. And through paintings such as Poussin's Judgment of Solomon, Louis XIV was communicating a very positive message to the public. Have faith in the judicial system. And he's pointing to the model of Solomon as being the perfect judge. And he even presents Solomon here, Poussin does, as a Christ-like figure with the halo set behind him. So this message is you can have absolute confidence in the justice of France and its judicial system, which is an important component of ruling and running in a country. Louis XIV knew the importance of propagandistic art, the way to communicate to the masses, and this is well before radio and television. The airwaves belonged to art. And art was always on, communicating to the masses the political messages that were encoded in these compositions. So it becomes a very useful political tool for the King of France. And he used Baroque classicism for its clarity, even heavy-handedness. So where are we at this point? We've been looking at the classical tradition, starting with Raphael's perfection of that tradition during the Roman High Renaissance. It was revived by Carracci, and now in mid-century Baroque, it's continued by Poussin. So the torch of classicism is now in the hands of Poussin. But listen, out of all of that mix, the classicism of Poussin is the most severe. He outdid the Italians at their own job, a Frenchman. And that's one reason why Louis XIV liked Poussin so much. He beat the Italians at their own job, the job of classical art. So of those three, the most severe practitioner is Poussin. Hey, let's look at landscape painting for a little bit. And in the 16th century, artists began to paint independent depictions of landscape. Before that, they were just backdrops to figural compositions in the foreground. But the idea of landscape painting developed in the 1500s. Well, now we're in the Baroque period, and these classical artists begin to set up a formula on how landscapes should be composed. So the classical formula of landscape painting was first devised by Carracci. And we're looking at an example right here. It's taken from the New Testament flight into Egypt, where the Holy Family leaves Judea and goes into Egypt. And look at the components. You have a foreground, a midground, and way back there, a background. You have people front and center, and they have to be important people, something from literature or the Bible. They can't be just peasants front and center. And you also have architecture, preferably classical architecture, or at least old architecture. And that becomes the formula that's picked up by subsequent classical artists when depicting landscapes, such as Poussin. So Poussin comes around again, like a couple of decades later, and he paints this. It's a passage from classical literature, landscape with the ashes of Phocion. Phocion was a Greek general, so the subject is historical, but look at the composition. You have a foreground, a midground, and a background, and they're clearly divided. You have architecture, and indeed it's classical in this case, and front and center, you have people. You have the widow of Phocion burying his ashes along with a servant. So the subject in classical landscape painting needs to be taken, as I said, from important literature like the Bible or Greek or Roman history. You also have a closed composition. You have a rough triangular configuration that sprawls across the painting in general, and then everything sympathetically leans towards that central axis. So it's closed in the classical tradition. Hey, speaking of subject matter, and this is important, okay? In the humanistic classical tradition coming out of the Renaissance and flourishing in the Baroque period, you have 5 traditional categories of subject matter, worthy subjects to be depicted in art. At the very top of this hierarchy is history painting. History painting is something taken as a subject from a historical subject, like the Bible, like Greco-Roman history, something like that. The second most important subject, iconography, is portraiture. It ranks just below history painting because you have portraits of such important people as popes and queens and kings and things, all right? So it can't be too far below historical painting. Now, the third and fourth positions are taken up by landscape painting, which we just saw, and genre painting, which we'll look at a little later. Depending on which art theorist you're reading, landscape or genre is given the higher ranking. But everybody agreed that still life painting was at rock bottom. They were like the grunt soldiers of the army of artists. So that's shelved way down below. And history painting was the absolute opposite at the very top, because a history painter had to command all of the other aspects: still life, portraiture, landscape, figure painting, all of that. And this is an important hierarchy that I want you to remember. In the 16th century, 1500s, Europe fell under a huge crisis, which affected the development of Baroque art in the following century. So we need to go back to the 16th century and consider some more backstory. It all started with this guy, Martin Luther, who was a German Augustinian monk, so a faithful member of the Mother Church, but he had some issues with church authority and church abuse. So one day in 1517, so early 16th century, he walked up to the door of a German church and tacked on the door a list of complaints against the way the church was running things. And this came to be known as the 95 Theses of Martin Luther. People started to read over his shoulder and say, yeah, I agree with that issue or this issue, and you had the beginnings, it was absolutely unanticipated, but you started a chain reaction, the beginnings of a huge protest up there in Northern Europe over what was going way down there in Italy, especially in Rome. And that led to the Protestant Reformation. Yeah, and you can see in the word Protestant the word protest, because these were protesters wanting to reform the way things were ran by the Catholic Church. So it spilled outside of the country of Germany and entered neighboring countries as well. Look how divided Europe became. The yellow areas are Catholic countries, but all of these guys are Protestant. And the green, it's a mix between Catholic and Protestant. So indeed, Europe became divided. And the Protestant Reformation was not simply a theological dispute. It became open conflict where you have mass riots and massacres, and it deteriorated even into class warfare. Here we see an image of Paris from 1572, and it all is a result of the Protestant Reformation. Up here you have executions, mass murder, rape, mutilation, even infanticide. So you have Europe thrown into this destructive chaos of the Protestant Reformation. All right, that ends part 2 of our 4th lecture.